everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Cheeky Natives. Happy New Year. This is our first episode for 2024, and I think we are starting it off with a bang. Exciting times. Hi, Litlokonolo.
I really love kind of the idea of like introducing our listeners to like new writers who are absolutely fantastic. I mean, the book that we are going to talk about today, you've got people calling it an exceptional debut, beautiful and immersive. So it's just so exciting to begin to speak about a book that is an exceptional debut.
Definitely. So, with that being said, I'd like to introduce our guest for today's episode, who is the author of My Life as a Chameleon. Her name is Diana Anyakwo. She grew up in Lagos, Nigeria. She's of mixed Irish and Nigerian heritage and moved to the UK when she was a teenager and later graduated from the University of Manchester with a degree in molecular biology and a master's in bioreactor systems. She spent 3 years in Athens, Greece, where she taught English and worked as an editor at an educational publisher. She currently lives and works in Manchester as a freelance writer and editor of English language teaching materials. She loves reading, writing, and binge watching TV series. She also loves going for long walks to help her get inspiration for her writing. And she is the author of this exceptional debut called My Life as a Chameleon. Welcome, Diana.
Thank you so much for that amazing welcome. And Happy New Year, everyone. Thank you.
You would have seen on our reads for 2023. Your debut was one of our top debuts for 2023. So we absolutely loved,
thank you so much.
And we wanted to have you on the podcast because we wanted to talk to just some of the incredible things that we think you do in the book. So thank you so much for joining us. The kind of first question we have is, the novel is written in a diary entry, filtering between different time periods, but not in a strict chronological order. So it's not like as you would expect a book to be told, right? Yeah. And we wanted to know if this decision was intentional.
Yes, yeah. It was originally, it didn't have that structure. But as I worked with my editor, publisher on it, we decided to help sort of ground the reader so that they understand that it's Lily as a 16-year-old kind of reflecting on her childhood. We thought that maybe including those kind of summary chapters at the beginning of each chapter where she sort of reflects on something that's happened and tries to understand it. And then she goes back into her sort of child voice, but it's still her as a 16-year-old. So it was kind of just to make that a bit clearer. Yeah, because originally it's felt more like an adult novel, I think, because it was that sort of child's voice rather than the teenage voice, if you know what I mean.
And it seems because the way in which you do this kind of non-chronological order is to nuance the idea that time is not linear in a way that we understand, right? Was there a reason for kind of wanting to trouble the waters around our understanding of time?
I think that just happened naturally. I don't know if I did it kind of consciously. I think what I was trying to show is just how like one event leads to the other, and then the consequences of that event results in something else happening, like almost a domino effect. And it became an easier way to like organize my thoughts, doing it in a sort of linear way from her childhood point of view. Yeah, so I think it just kind of happened naturally, but without thinking. Yeah, because it's an interesting point, actually.
And I suppose also one of the other things that I suppose Alma and I were thinking about is this idea, because it felt for us that it was also a commentary on memory, perspective, and this idea of linearity, right? So there was kind of summaries at the beginning of where we are in the moment, but then reflections. It's also interesting to think about like the idea of like different people in the story could have different memories of a particular event, different perspective. We wanted to know if that kind of the way in which you wrote it was a commentary on that.
Yeah, I was thinking about that as I was writing it. It's partly based on my life. It's a sort of autobiographical novel, but there's a lot of fiction in it. So I had to ask, some family members, things that they remembered, when I was trying to check facts. And sometimes, and even when I gave some of my family members the book to read, they didn't remember certain events happening at all. They're like, what are you talking about? It's this fiction. And for me, that was like a fact. So I found that quite interesting as I was writing it, just the idea that we all remember things and like choose to remember things based on where we are in our kind of journey, our life journey. And we see things, each of us within the family sees things in a different way, basically. And I found that interesting to explore, and just an interesting question to ask about memory, which I think is mainly fiction a lot of the time.
This book is written in a very interesting way, right? Because you've chosen to write it in first person narration, and that's quite an interesting literary device to tell a story. And I'm thinking particularly about Lily's story and what it reveals about her story for it to have been written in the first person, right? And I guess the question is, what are you hoping to allow us to witness in doing this? Because in many ways, you are witnesses to this first person account of all these things that happened to Lily.
I really wanted the reader to like experience Lily's life rather than to watch it unfold. And I found that the first person, and also when she was having her memories, originally I had written it in the past tense, but I sort of explored changing it to the present tense. And I felt that made it a bit more immediate. So I wanted, the reader to kind of experience what she was feeling, and some of the anxiety, the fear, because I love books that are written like that, where you feel that you're inside the character's mind and you're like experiencing their world. And I think it can be nice, like if you're feeling very, I don't know, alone or lonely or low or something, and you read something, and for me, it gives me that sense of connection with another person. So yeah, that's sort of what I wanted to achieve with that.
I mean, Lily's a child, right? So we often get told that children's remembering of things or their recollection is not great. And there's a thing about the ways in which children's voices are not trusted to tell sort of the events that have taken place, right? So a child will say something and adults will be like, that's not how it happened,
Yeah.
etc., etc.
Yeah.
Make a very particular editorial decision for Lily to be the one who, despite being the child of the family, is the one who gets to tell the story of. And I guess I'm curious about how you think that affected the ways in which the story was believable for readers, but also affected their reception, right? Because this is a child's recollection of what has happened in her family. When she has much older siblings, she has her parents, but she's the one who gets to tell the story.
Yeah. Yeah, I wanted it to be Lily as the child remembering the story, because I think we do, like, as grown-ups and parents, sometimes sort of dismiss what children say, and don't take what they're saying as being the truth, or we think it's just their imagination. But I wanted to give her that voice, like as an individual, and like these are the facts as she is recounting them. And I did kind of make her an unreliable narrator. There are some conclusions that she makes about her father and her family that aren't correct. And I hope that was sort of clear in the novel. I tried to make it sort of subtle. Like she just assumes that her family, her siblings don't care about her because they're so much older, and maybe they treat her like she's, they don't really kind of respect her. She's just like a little girl to them. So yeah, I just wanted to give her that voice, basically, and knowing that fact. And I did put in a sort of scene that she does make up, actually, where she really is telling lies, big, bad lies in school because she's been bullied by a teacher. So I did want to make her like a real child that, does do those sort of things.
I mean, Lily's an interesting character in that she's a child and she has this vivid imagination. But she's also tasked with the responsibility of telling a family story, and that's quite a big responsibility for it. Can she be trusted with the story? So in reeling the story, can we trust that Lily can bear the responsibility? I think that it's a very interesting editorial choice to have chosen Lily to be the one that sort of bears the task of remembering and recollecting and putting things together.
Yeah. I think that, yeah, that we can trust her, but I also wanted to show that she's partly unreliable because some of the experiences that she's had have made her feel that the world is unsafe and have made her, assume certain things about her father and her family and friends. And I wanted to show that how, yeah, what happens to you can make you a certain way, like psychologically. But yeah, I think in terms of, yeah, trusting her to tell that big story, yeah, I did.
It's interesting that you speak about kind of, we've been speaking about this idea of trust and particularly Lily, but also the ways in which her experiences lead her to have, particular perspective, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things I think that she brings forth is this idea of estrangement and distance and abandonment, which are common themes for a lot of people in the book, right? But we
Yeah.
know that they are frontal because of Lily and because
Yeah.
of how he portrays these events, right?
Yeah.
And, in Lily's mind, is displacement. In maybe someone else's mind, it may be we're taking you away because your dad is not doing well and we want you to
Yeah.
be protected for what is happening,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah.
And also the estrangement, kind of, as you've highlighted, is that Lily feels because she's the last born, right? The pecking order is different.
Yeah.
These people have gotten the best of her parents, and she's just kind of
Yes.
the last bit, right?
Yeah.
It seems to be quite a big theme in the book for a number of the characters. And we wanted to know, what are your own reflections, right? Or what are some of the things you wanted to reflect or bring forth in thinking about displacement, distance, abandonment, and kind of all these kind of bad feelings or bad things, right, through Lily?
Yeah. I think just wanted to show what that feels like and how for some people it can happen in childhood because of something that has happened that might not even be that bad. I mean, Lily is removed from her home because her father is not well, and it takes time. There's a sort of a crisis. So it's really, if she was living maybe it's the 80s, it's Nigeria, but if she was living maybe in the UK, she'd probably, I don't know, maybe social services would have got involved and put her maybe in a foster home. So this is kind of the way, they've dealt with it. But in her mind, of course, because she's a child, she doesn't understand it. Well, at first she thinks it's a fun adventure that she's going to go on, and then reality hits her, and it's a terrible shock. But yeah, I think that all of them experience a form of abandonment, including the mother. You know, I think she feels very abandoned, the mother, because she's Irish, she's in Nigeria, she doesn't have much support from her family. And at that time, when she married her husband, it would have been, many years before Lily was born. It wasn't kind of the done thing, for mixing in Nigeria. So she probably would have married her husband maybe in the 50s or something like that. So she's kind of suffered some abandonment from her family, from her community of expatriates. And she's kind of formed a little bit of a community with these other Niger wives, but she's also a bit of a proud woman, and she doesn't really want to reveal what's going on in her like marriage and her home. So she's carrying all of this with nobody really to unload to or to ask, like, and she's also, as a foreign woman, like in the 80s, she didn't have that many rights, like working rights. She wouldn't have been entitled to like a pension, or there was nobody she could like call, for help. So she feels very abandoned, and she kind of self-abandons a bit by comforting in alcohol and just being a bit distant in her own worries, sort of thing, and sort of abandoning her child because she's not really completely all there for Lily, because she's trying to work because her husband isn't able to work because of his illness. And yeah, and then there's the sister and the sisters and the brother, and there's a brother and a sister that go to England in boarding school, and in a way they are abandoning because things have got a bit intolerable. They know there's something wrong. Things have changed from when they were a child, so they're abandoning their home and pretty much their country, and they're just trying to like forget that they come from Nigeria, forget all of it, and just adapt to life in England and be like good English citizens and just try and put everything behind. So that's yeah, so each of them. But I think the worst abandonment is actually for the father, because it's his whole family have kind of alienated him, and they want the mother's love, but around him nobody's relaxed. Everybody's acting kind of, you know, tension. And from Lily's siblings, there was a time when he was okay, and he was they were able to interact. They went on holidays. So for me, I thought I wanted to show how actually he's been abandoned by his family. Even his wife is a little bit, although she doesn't abandon him, but she's still on edge all the time around him, afraid that he's going to have an episode. And so I think that's one of the saddest things, that it's not his fault that he's got, but it's just the way it is. Yeah.
It's interesting that you speak about kind of the fathers being abandoned, right? We know the abandonment kind of happens because of what ends up happening with him. He's ill. And it's in the 80s, kind of like
Yeah.
in the world, right? So we
Mm.
aren't really having open conversation about kind of mental illness and familial
No.
relationships, right? So Lily's father has schizophrenia, right?
Yeah.
And maybe at that point we don't even know that it was schizophrenia, but we understand now that it's schizophrenia, and we're reading kind of new knowledge. But we think of the limited vocabulary and thinking around like generally mental illness, right? In particular, in places like Nigeria, which are religious societies and which are like, oh, it's a demon, you need to be excised and all of that, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And that, I think, is particularly sad, right? But what meaning does family ascribe to his illness, and how does that shape his family?
I think the family, they don't really understand what's wrong with him. The mother does, but she's not explaining it to anybody. And they don't understand how, like the older brother and the sisters, they don't understand how their dad, who has, they used to have a good time with him. He was a good dad, has slowly become this sort of presence that's always in their lounge. He doesn't go to work anymore. He was a doctor. And I think it's just like a big elephant in the room for the whole family. There's something wrong. Nobody talks about it. Maybe the siblings sort of whisper about it, but the mother just always says, you don't upset your dad, don't upset your daddy. So for them, they just know that there's something wrong, but they don't know what it is. They don't really understand.
They kind of sweep it under the rug, right?
Yeah, so they just sweep it under the rug.
In many ways wants to protect her children, but in protecting her children is also making it a little bit difficult for the children to deal with the reality of mental illness.
Yeah.
But do you not think that there's also an element of her wanting to protect her husband, right? So you think a lot about the associations, and I think it would be interesting for us to speak a little bit about that, right?
Yeah.
The husband is revered. He's a doctor.
Exactly.
He's got a particular social standing. And of course, that means that it's almost like inconceivable that he is the person that has mental illness and had this kind of mental illness. And a lot of the things that the mom does, and I guess subsequent to that, is in many ways to protect her husband. So there's a thing about the ways in which women will protect their spouses and their loved ones, sometimes to the detriment of their families, right? You think about how they navigate his illness and how they speak about it, and a lot of the hushing and you know, the walking around almost on those eggshells is because there's a protection, a very particular kind of protection that they want to offer the father. But I'm curious about what that then means for the familial relationships, right? What does that mean for how Lily gets to remember her father, or how she gets to remember what her family may be? Because there seems to be like this very clear chasm between how her older siblings remember their family and how she experiences the family, and it's completely different.
Yes.
And there's something about the ways in which the mental illness is really what forms that chasm.
Yes, yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's really interesting. That is basically the main reason that the wife, the mother, doesn't want to, you know, talk about what the husband has, schizophrenia, because he was a doctor, and she doesn't want to spoil his, you know, reputation. And there's just so much shame associated with. She herself doesn't really understand it. It's, you know, she knows that he has it, but she doesn't want to ruin everything that he's built, because she's been with him for so many years. So she knows his whole history, where he comes from, what he's come from. So that's part of it. And she doesn't want her children to view their father in that way, like as almost in her mind weak because of his illness. She still wants them to think that, okay, maybe he's just a bit strict and quiet and strange, but that's just the Nigerian father. At least that's better than seeing your father as being weak, or, you know, there's something, you know, intolerable wrong with him. And for Lily and the family, I think that means that for her family, it's like a big chasm. So her father just seems to be this almost, you know, he's on a lot of medication. He's not really part of that illness, does kind of make the person very sort of blank and not very emotional and not very empathetic. So when she's dealing with him, she can't really relate to him. She can't really, you know, feel. And maybe there might be a few episodes where he will almost wake up from his sort of slumber or catharsis, and he will interact with her, and she cherishes those moments, but they're so few and far between and so unpredictable that it makes her feel her home family life is just very kind of chaotic. But it's the only life that she knows, so it's not until she's a teenager that she starts looking back and then questioning it. Yeah. um,
I think also in questioning it, it's also been like, oh, I thought my life was perfect, right? So I thought,
yeah.
but upon reflection, actually, there is a lot that's wrong.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, yeah. 'Cause
There's a lot that was going on, you know.
yeah, that's like,
So it's again interesting to think about like what we spoke about earlier in relation to memory, right? So like her child self wants to hold on to these memories, but her
yeah,
teenage, it's kind of like, yeah, but maybe some of those things did not actually happen the way that you think they happened. And
yeah.
actually it was more chaos than it was,
Then
right?
yeah, exactly.
Or
And
maybe
that's,
you ascribed
yeah,
meaning because nobody spoke to you about it. So you were forced to fill in the gaps
yeah,
yourself. Something children often do, right?
yes, yeah.
So I'm curious about, just to tie that in around death, right? So, you know, thinking about what we're speaking about, just mental illness and familial relationships, how Lily mourns her father and how her siblings remember and mourn her father are so different, right? And I guess I'm curious about what grief means when you have to experience it almost in absence, right?
Yeah,
And almost a different and a distant remembering, because how they experience their father, of course, because of his mental illness, is completely different as siblings.
yes.
But also it means that their grief also looks different. They grieve nonetheless, but there's a different way in which they experience grief. Now, I was hoping we could speak about that a little bit.
Yeah. So when her father does die, she's 11, I think. And yeah, the the funeral and the family, the way they grieve is much more emotional. There's a lot more kind of show of sadness, of, desperation. Her mother is in a really bad state. Her brother really breaks down. Her sister, the middle sister, not so much. She's a little bit kind of apart, kind of thing, because she's trying to just keep herself at a distance from the whole thing. She just wants to go back to England and forget that this whole thing happened. But so Lily doesn't really, and then there's also the father's Nigerian relations who are very vocal, like at the funeral. And she's really upset, like when she sees that, like his sister even tries to jump into the coffin, which is something that does happen in some sort of Nigerian funerals. It's like to show
Love
off
that. Listen, they want to jump
into the
not even the
coffin, yeah.
coffin. They want to jump in. They're like,
Yeah.
so,
So
so
she's
we know.
like screaming. There's a lot of screaming. There's a lot of wailing. There's, all kinds of things happening. And all this, like all these people with like this outpouring of grief and sadness. And she's kind of wondering, like, oh my God, why don't I feel like this? And she's trying to think back, like, to her dad. She had sort of been making a little bit of a connection with him in her mind before he died. He had had like strokes and he was paralyzed. So she had come back from the UK and was back in Manchester. So she was kind of going and sitting with him and reading to him and talking to him and saying the things that maybe she wouldn't have said if he was kind of okay, able to
Yeah.
kind of move and speak and whatever. So in her mind, she was kind of making a connection with him, but she still, doesn't feel what everybody else is feeling. She's not acting like everybody else, and she feels really bad. She feels very like ashamed, and she's almost trying to make herself feel something, make herself like sad, make herself, and she just gets really like angry with herself. So I think, yeah, it's almost a difficult thing if you're grieving over somebody that you had a complex relationship with. I think that can be really hard. Yeah. So that, yeah.
I mean, I'm someone who, when I lost my mom, we had a really complicated relationship. And so I
Mm.
kind of related quite a bit with this idea of like grief not being singular, but also grief not being linear. Because on the
Mm.
one hand, you've lost a parent. On the other hand, you're like, but like we weren't on the greatest of terms. So what is this that I'm feeling, right?
Yes.
And it was
Yeah.
interesting for her to ask those questions about like, okay, everybody is like sad and like deeply like hurt. And
Mm.
I'm kind of sad, but I
She's
don't
kind of
know.
almost a little relieved, but she
Yeah,
doesn't want to admit that to herself. She's almost, yeah, just a little bit relieved. And especially when her and the mom are just together there in the house and there isn't that presence hanging over them. And it's kind
it
of,
feels like the dad was like a succulent that was just sucking
yes,
the room and taking so much from the
yes,
mom,
yeah,
and there was no room for her. And now
yeah,
finally, oh, I know this is evil, but like finally we can be together. There's
yes,
room
yeah,
for us.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah,
And
yeah,
maybe
it's
and maybe
fine.
that is the complexity of grief and of I guess
Mm,
relationships, right? That you can love somebody dearly, but also
hmm.
sometimes not like them, right? Or
Yes, yes,
not like how they make you feel. And it's unpopular to say I don't
yeah,
like a particular relative of mine. And I mean,
yeah,
it's a big ask for Lily, right? Because for as long
mm,
as he's been alive, her father hasn't been well. Her
no,
siblings have
no,
very clear, memories of like her father, and there's a particular navigation that there's a grieving that they get to do while he's alive because there's a
mm,
relationship that is the illness. And we don't see that for Lily. And I guess it's an ask of the reader, right? Is to
mm,
say, how do you hold space for grief and in the absence of having a firm relationship that can almost anchor, because her older siblings have the memories of him when he's well as
yeah,
an anchor.
yeah,
They can actually hold on to, he hasn't always been like this, he's unwell, and
mm,
there's a particular compassion that they can have for his illness that I think is very difficult to ask of a child.
yes, yeah. exactly. And yeah, that's basically what I wanted to show, how how hard it is that, and also how because she knows he's not well, but she still doesn't like him. It's not really his fault that he's not well, but it is what it is, and it makes her grief more difficult because she's a child as well, so she doesn't really understand what's going on. Whereas as an adult, you sort of know you have those feelings, but maybe you're able to cope with them more. Mm,
So I'm thinking about primary caregiving, right? And I think a lot about just how, like, your health is just unpredictable. You may need your partner at some point to be a caregiver for you. And
yeah.
there's a particular effect that this has on Lily's mom, right?
Mm,
This is in the ways that she's unable to show up for Lily and even herself sometimes, right? And you ask the reader to do a difficult thing because you ask the reader to hold grace for her while
yeah.
also acknowledging that there is a very particular kind of neglect and
Yeah.
harm that Lily experiences. And I guess the question is, what is the navigation or what is the meaning that you ascribe to the complexity of this relationship? Because, of course, Lily's mom would not be the person that she is if she didn't have to be a primary caregiver in almost every sense of the word. But that
Mm,
doesn't negate the fact that Lily is neglected and Lily suffers real harm. What
yeah.
is what does the grace look like in the situation? But also, what does accountability look like in them then having an honest conversation as a family?
Yeah. Yeah, I really wanted to show the mother as just being human because I feel that in society, in Nigerian society, just in most countries, mothers are held up as they have to, be martyrs. They have to do everything right for their children. They have to put their children first. And I think many do, but sometimes, they can make a mistake, when they're in between in a situation that's quite unbearable. And I just kind of wanted to, it's a difficult ask, but I just wanted to have that kind of a bit of empathy and kind of just to know, okay, so she's clearly done some wrong things here, but this woman, she does love her daughter, but she's in a really difficult situation. She doesn't have anybody to turn to, and she's too proud to ask maybe one of her Niger wife friends for help or something so that maybe Lily could stay in Nigeria or something like that. She thinks maybe sending Lily to where her brother is a safer option, just out of the country. So yeah, I just wanted to hold that in as an idea that why do mothers have to be judged so harshly if they make a mistake? I know that there are some mothers that, they make a mistake and they have no, regret or whatever, but there are some that are just, everything is just against them and they're just trying to survive and they think that maybe what they're doing is helping the child when maybe it's not. So, yeah, it was just to kind of highlight the humanity of a mother. Mm.
I'm a little mad, to be honest, right? So in her, in this kind of grace that we give her, because you understand that life, as we've spoken about, life
Yeah.
happens and show up, right? But she sends Lily to England to her brother. She sends Lily to another kid.
Yes, yeah, yeah.
Like, go
Yeah.
on another kid. And
Yeah.
also go to another kid in circumstances where this other kid is living with other children
Yeah.
and the mom, right? So it's like,
Yeah. Like another
Lily, actually,
family.
I don't care. Just go, you'll figure it
Yeah.
out.
Yeah.
And it's so fascinating for me to think about when you think about the West and you think about Africa, right, or so-called global South, you think about the
Mm,
ways in which the gaze has portrayed the kind of African world as this impoverished, lacking world, right? But we see
mm.
through these kind of deporting, because I feel like they just deported her. They just
She's
said, you know
deported.
what, go.
Yeah.
The reality is it's rough, right? Because the social position and the class hierarchy in Nigeria and in the UK are vastly different. Because
Yes, yes.
at least in Nigeria, we could have particular kind of food, right?
Yeah, yeah.
In the UK, there are food stamps involved. There are maybe we can't eat
Hmm.
this today
Yeah,
because we reserve it until the week. So that juxtaposition was really interesting for me, particularly in thinking about the ways in which the West is viewed in comparison to kind of
yeah.
Africa and the global South, right? And I suppose it allows Lily to see kind of the privilege, what
Mm.
privilege, like recognizing her own kind of privilege in society, right? As this Black
Yeah,
girl who comes from Nigeria and who comes from a Walo family and comes to this
yeah.
white family who you assume are going to be good, but you're like,
Yes.
oh, these people, we be eating the same thing 3 days in the week because there's no money. And I wanted
Yeah.
to speak about kind of that juxtaposition because it was interesting it is, yes, a commentary on kind of social position and class hierarchy, but I think it's also a reflection on Lily coming to terms with her own privilege in relation to where she comes from in Nigeria.
Yeah, I think that she's really shocked when she goes to Manchester. And I think that like what's happened sort of behind the scenes is that Luke, the brother, hasn't actually told the mother the circumstances that they're living in. And he's just, said, oh, yeah, we live in a great, great house, great family. She'll be fine here, without really explaining because he's actually run away from boarding school. And the mother has just believed him, but maybe just because she wants to believe him. So I think with Lily, yeah, she had no idea that her life was so good in Nigeria. She didn't, and she lived in a kind of little bubble in Nigeria, both before she goes to Manchester and also when she goes to the American school afterwards. And she's not really aware, of just maybe she sees things, she sees poverty, but it doesn't really like affect her because she's a child. She just doesn't really get it, kind of thing. But then when she goes to Manchester, she's living with this family in a very deprived area. They don't have a lot of money. I mean, her mom has sent money for her keep and everything, and that's pretty much supporting the family. And she just can't even understand it. I mean, she has been so spoiled that, when she arrives, she thinks that somebody's going to give her a bath because she's used to having like a nanny give her a bath or something. So that's her first shock. And she's just like, what's going on here? And then she's also had this kind of view of England because of the books that she would have read, which would be in Nigeria, it would be a lot of Enid Blyton, Agatha Christie, that kind of thing, which I loved as a child. But they portrayed England as being like a very, like a place where everybody's kind of rich and happy and everything's wonderful. And there's nothing about like any kind of deprivation or anything. They're always having like their cucumber sandwiches and their strawberries and that's what she's kind of expecting. And then she gets to this place and it's really like quite derelict and quite depressing. And she's kind of in shock, but she's just trying to make the best of it because I think that I also wanted to kind of show that, like, because I do think children are a bit more resilient to change and they do kind of go into something with a bit more of an open mind and curiosity. Whereas when you're an adult, you're kind of, no, not going to do this. And I think Lily is quite like adaptable in that way, even though she's not like had a massive tantrum and said, I'm leaving now, because she also doesn't really want to go home to where her dad is.
She
And
also
she's,
can't leave, right? And there's like an optimism that I guess children
Mhm.
have to have because in many
Yeah,
ways, and I think what's interesting that she's talking about her brother because the familial relationships in this book are so interesting, right?
mm,
Lily is the youngest child, and
yeah,
Lily gets to be excused from the realities of her family in ways that her older
mm,
siblings can't. So
yeah,
Lily is protected a lot from the realities of her family, sometimes to her detriment.
yeah,
But there is a thing about the oldest children and how the mother almost co-parents with her children in a way that's like a
yes,
parentification that
yeah,
then for children of a very particular experience. And so there's the concept of like the deputy parents, but there's also the very real ways in which these children disappoint their parents, right? So, excuse me, her sister goes off and gets married in the midst of all these things that are happening, and effectively like leaves her family. Her brother drops out of school.
She's just like, I'm out, y'all.
I'm out of here.
Everybody seems to want to escape, right?
Yes,
There's almost
yes.
escape. And I guess what we see as disappointment may also be proxy for another emotion. And I wanted us to talk about the sibling relationship because it's really interesting. Just birth order and how everybody behaves in this book is so interesting.
Thank you. I think that, yeah, Lily just really looks up to her older siblings and she almost views them as like parents, basically, because, well, her father's pretty much absent and her mother's absent a lot of the time because of work and everything. So she kind of seeks guidance from them, from her oldest sister in particular, and then her brother when she goes to Manchester. But then between the siblings, there is this kind of dynamic as well. There's a little bit of tension between the two sisters. One sister has sort of chosen to kind of embrace her Nigerianness, stay in Nigeria and embrace the culture. Whereas the other sister is just like, I want to be out of here. And she goes, she's quite happy in her boarding school experience and she's loving it in England. And then the brother, he just wants something different. He's not really that happy in boarding school, but he doesn't want to come home either. So he's just kind of gone off on his own with his girlfriend and tried to make a life for himself. Yeah.
It's interesting to think about the ways in which, and I think this happens a lot, right? Like when you have like a number of siblings, you write in the book like, or Lily reflects that Megan is the prettiest, right? She's like a princess.
Yeah.
And perfect little ringlets. And like it's so annoying, right?
Yes, yeah.
And we think about the ways in which she's obviously like, I want to say pimped out, but people are like, oh, that's Megan. She's a looker. She's going to get the people, like stuff like that, right? And we think about, like, Sophie was also pretty, but not pretty from Megan because Sophie has an afro and an afro is different, kind of the ways in which the standards of beauty work. Right?
Yes.
The more European you look, the more desirable you are, right? And I think that you're talking about that kind of friction between them. Like, trust me, you be black. And I suppose it's quite interesting because the kind of novel in some parts is, and the background, these people come from Nigeria. And we've seen a number of conversations kind of in recent years about like Nigerians asserting that like the first time they've encountered race as a concept is outside of Nigeria, right?
Yeah.
Outside of the idea of like, oh, in the US, I was black for the first time, right?
Yes.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about like these ideas of the conceptions of race and the ideas of blackness, when particularly you are a mixed race person. So you do have a white parent and a black parent. And subsequently, like, kind of been introduced to a place like the UK, which has strict racial hierarchies. So it must be jarring for, I mean, Lily's brother, Luke, has been there for a while, so he probably knows the lays of the land, right? Lily's there and she gets to school and she's black, Gosh, like what? I'm black?
Yeah, it's a shock for her because she hasn't really thought about what she is until she goes to Manchester. She hasn't really thought about her blackness or anything like that. But so I think that the brother and the oldest sister experience that more than the middle sister. So she seems to be able to get away with it because maybe she's got more European features or there's just something she just seems to escape all of that. But the older sister, when she went to, there's like a conversation where she's talking about when she went to boarding school and she experienced some really bad racism and she actually ran away and she hitched a ride with a lorry driver to get away from the school and came back. And of course, when she came back to Nigeria, her dad was better then. The dad was okay because that was many years ago. He was not sympathetic at all. So, and
Not-
it was like
it's
he was
like
gonna,
education is the key,
yeah,
right?
exactly. He was gonna, I think he beat her and like, what are you talking about? I had to go to Ireland to study to be a doctor and I swallowed it. And I thought that that was, I wanted to bring that conversation in because I think that's a really common theme with a certain generation. I don't know if in other parts of Africa, but in Nigeria, where you send your children abroad and you don't really think about, the consequences and what they're going to feel and how, it's going to be the first time they really feel their skin color. And I think that there was a generation that went abroad, like my father in the 40s. He went in the 40s to Ireland and I expect he must have experienced racism. I don't know because my father passed away when I was young and I didn't get to talk to him about it. But my mom said that he did. And I think there would have been also men that came to the UK in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and they probably did experience racism, but they swallowed it down and didn't, they just took it, and they just absorbed it. And I sometimes wonder, does that contribute, to later mental health issues and, like, because I know that within our community in Nigeria, we had several family friends, including my father, who had mental illness, basically. So it was quite common, So I think the stress of, going abroad and not just their race, but also just going abroad, going to another country. And at that time, 40s, 50s, 60s, it would have been so different from, and I was just kind of questioning, like, what does that effect have on the person long term? Like, kind of striving so hard for your education, for your, and not looking after yourself, if you know what I mean. So yeah, I was kind of questioning that and how, yeah, it's usually at that time, fathers wouldn't be sympathetic if you know, did that or complained about school or said they were being racist. That would just be rubbish. I don't know what it's like now. I'm hoping things are
No.
better.
It's still the same, right? It's still the same.
Oh gosh.
In many ways in African societies, and maybe we're thinking about more broadly Black societies, it's
Mm.
like when I was your age, I
Mm,
did
yeah.
not have these opportunities. What do you mean you're stressed? What do you mean it's
Yes.
hard? All you
Yeah,
need to do is study,
exactly.
you know?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the most triggering phrases when I was your age. I just think that is just, oh. I also, when Lily goes to Manchester, I also wanted to show how it wasn't just like white people who were prejudiced against her. She suffered a lot of prejudice because she was African. And that was something she hadn't expected because when she did see Black people in her school, she thought, oh, thank God, they're going to be my friends, But then when they found out that she was from Africa, there was this like, oh my gosh, so you're swinging in trees or, there's all these like awful stereotypes and she can't understand, like she just doesn't expect this. Like it's bad enough, the racism, but racism from Black people, I mean prejudice, because of where she comes from. And I think that is partly because like at the time when you would switch on the TV, there would just be all these like adverts, these charity adverts of Africa. I mean, there still is actually, but they were really bad in those days. So people just thought that's all Africa was. Like, it's just a hut. You live in a hut. You have to walk like 10 miles from your water. You don't have a house. So this is a big shock to Lily that people think like this. And she's the only African person in the school, because in the 80s there weren't that many African people. There were only a few. There were more Caribbean people who came in the Windrush kind of era. Yeah.
There's a state-sponsored violence that we see in
Mm,
the book, right? And in different iterations, but in every iteration, it's almost a weapon for white supremacy, right? And that's interesting in the face of this contrast, because whether you're in Nigeria, whether you're in Manchester, there's a very particular kind of state-sponsored violence. It may take different forms, right? It may be soldiers in Nigeria wanting to exert power over you. It
yeah.
may
Yeah.
be
Mm,
black boys experiencing police violence in Manchester, but there is a violence by the state that you see at different points, and it's an interesting contrast. Now, I wanted to know why you felt that it was important to include that kind of violence across the world, right? Because it almost feels as though there is no place that is an oasis for blackness, right? So at every point, the state will be used or will
yeah.
be a way in which people can exert violence upon you.
Mm. Yeah, I did want to include that because the time that Lily goes to Manchester in the 80s was a time when there was a lot of tension in the UK between Black people, also Irish people, and the police. And there was a lot of this sort of stop and search, and, Black people basically being beaten up by gangs of police. And as a result, there were a number of riots around the UK, and there were riots around that time because of all of this. And it was also because the North was very deprived. They were kind of, the government just wasn't giving, the conservative government wasn't giving any support at that time in the 80s. So I just wanted to show that. I kind of just didn't want to like gloss over. I thought it was an important part of history to show because I knew that it kind of happened around the time she was there. So I just, yeah, I wanted to give like witness to that, and for Lily to witness that, because Lily has the view that, the white policeman is, they're like safe, they're all gentlemen, they're all good, and everybody's kind and wonderful, from the books that she's read. So I just wanted to give her like you know, a reality check. But then I also wanted to compare it with just daily life in Nigeria with police checkpoints, military coups, that kind of thing, which she is used to. She understands that. So for her, that was just part of life. So she's more shocked by the violence that she sees in Manchester.
Mm.
Mm.
And it's also interesting because I think you're saying being witness to the historical, to kind of even say like Black people's lives have been precarious throughout history, right? Yes,
Mm.
the more visceral kind of examples, but even in just ordinary life, right, for
Yeah,
Nigerians, for a person like Lily, that
yeah.
the violence is there. I I thought Lily was interesting because Lily reminded me a little bit of myself. Like she really struggled to fit in, right?
Oh, yes. She just
She kind of just
really,
existed like on the periphery, like
yeah,
how
yeah,
to make a friend.
yeah,
That friend then started stealing her money.
yeah.
Poor Lily. And I wanted to speak a little bit about that, right? So the idea of Lily kind of existing in the periphery, because we know as we get to know Lily, Lily feels like she's the odd one out in her family. And now
Yes.
when we see like Lily becoming kind of the odd one out in society, and I want to know a little bit about like that oddity, right? So the peripheral Lily and why it was important for you to write her in that way.
Yeah, I wanted to just explore what it feels like to, you know, not be the person that fits in, that, has groups of friends, that, that's always kind of a bit stable in their and secure in their friendships. Lily, on purpose, really, she doesn't fit in her family, but life circumstances have made it difficult for her to fit in anywhere because she's sort of been uprooted. She's changed schools. She's gone to one school in Nigeria, then gone to a school in Manchester, then one in Nigeria, then an American school. So it's difficult for her to form long-lasting friendships. And then at the same time, she feels just odd, probably because she has that feeling of otherness within her own family, and she carries that with her when she interacts with other people. And then also, I felt because of all the things that have happened to her with, the father, with being uprooted as a teenager, she's extremely needy and possessive. And I think as a teenager, it's probably your most vulnerable time because you kind of get your identity from the people around you. I think that your peers really, you're very dependent on your peers for forming your identity, I think. And she's finding it difficult to find a group of friends that she can trust. She's going about it the wrong way because she's had such a disjointed childhood, moving from place to place and school to school, that she's not quite learned the way of interacting. And once she does get a friend, she's like, oh my God, thank God. And she wants to hold on to that friend and not let that friend talk to anybody else. And she gets really obsessed with them and a bit almost controlling. So I was kind of like, yeah, just almost making, because I think also when you're a teenager, your friendships are so important. They're like, they're probably more powerful than your romantic involvements in some ways. Yeah, and I just wanted to show how she, in the different places that she exists, she doesn't seem to fully fit in. So when she comes back, she doesn't really fit in Manchester at all. But then she comes back and she goes to a Nigerian school and she doesn't completely fit in there, but she's the happiest there. She feels more at home there. It's something she knows and understands. And then she goes to an American school, and there's quite a lot of different nationalities, but she doesn't quite, she finds it difficult to find her own little clique, basically. Yeah. But yeah, I just wanted to explore what it feels like when you're on the periphery of everything and you're watching from the sidelines, everybody having a great time, and you're longing to be part of that. But then sometimes you just want to be blend in and nobody notice you, sort of thing. So you're kind of, you want two things at once.
Mm-hmm. Sure, this was quite an enlightening conversation. Thank you, Diana. Thank you so
Thank you
much.
so much.
And I guess you can tell from this conversation that we really enjoyed reading about Lily and Lily's life as a chameleon.
Yeah.
And I guess really, in closing, the question would be, what do you hope that this book will do? Now that the book is out there, this is your debut, you've put it out there. What do you hope that Lily's story will do?
I hope that anyone who feels on the periphery or feels alone, that kind of loneliness that you sometimes feel where you don't kind of have anyone to talk to, or you just feel, yeah, like an outsider. I hope that anybody who feels like that would read it and, feel better and less alone and feel that human connection. Yeah.
Like, it's been such a wonderful conversation, and thank
Oh,
you
thank you.
for writing this book. And like, as Alma said, obviously we've loved this book, right? And again, Cheeky Natives, we encourage you to go out and buy my Life as a Chameleon. Obviously, you can just DM us and say, hey, we're looking to get a copy, and then we'll hook you up. But again, please do not DM the author and say, hey, author, please send me a PDF copy. We don't do that. Please do not DM the author. But again, Diana, from the Cheeky Natives, thank you so much. We hoped that you are writing, or maybe you'll give us a cheeky preview and say, oh, I'm working on my next piece of work, right? We hope to see you again on the Cheeky Natives to talk about more of your work. But thank you so much for spending time with us and taking us into your confidence and making us become friends of Lily rather than voyagers.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed the conversation. It's been great.
All right, Cheeky Natives, until next time, Dr. A.
See you on the flip side. Thank you so much, Cheeky Natives. Bye.
Bye.